Hey guys, the purpose of this video is to walk you through your first paper. In this video, I'm really just going to read through the assignment sheet and then I'll pause at various places to kind of expand on what you see here. So if you feel like you fully understand the assignment sheet and you don't have any questions, or you're ready to get started, you might not need to watch this video. But if you've read through the assignment sheet, or even if you haven't read through the assignment sheet, if you have a lot of questions, if you are just looking for maybe some extra explanation or need more information, then this video is for you. So paper one is on analyzing realism. A lot of the authors in our first unit are authors that really focus on writing in sort of that realism genre, or critical thinking or critical theory of literature and analyzing a text for its real elements. That's why we're starting with this concept of figuring out what these authors have to say using realism. Your first paper is worth 200 points. Before your paper is due, I will also ask you for a thesis statement and a really detailed outline, so be on the lookout for that in the course calendar, in the course schedule. Before I get started kind of going through the prompt, I wanted to offer this quote here because I feel like when we use the word realism, I think if we aren't really studying it, and we're going to study it a little bit next week, but if you haven't really studied it, or if you're just kind of thinking on the surface level, then realism might to you just be seen as an author who's writing about real things, things that really happen or could happen or have happened. And I think that while that's true, I want you to think about realism and especially how it relates to literature, or the fact that it definitely relates to literature. I want you to think about that in a little bit of a deeper way. And so I feel like this quote kind of helps us to get in the mood of analyzing literature as it takes on these realist characteristics. So from George Parsons Lathrop in the novel In Its Future, he writes, "Realism sets itself at work to consider characters and events which are apparently the most ordinary and uninteresting, in order to extract from these their full value and true meaning. It would apprehend in all particulars the connection between the familiar and the extraordinary, and the seen and unseen of human nature. Beneath the deceptive cloak of outwardly uneventful days, it detects and endeavors to trace the outlines of the spirits that are hidden there. In short, realism reveals. Where we thought nothing worth of notice, it shows everything to be rife with significance." So what I think is really interesting about this quote is that it highlights maybe one of the issues I have with realism, in that realism is very ordinary. It's very mundane. It's very everyday life, right? There's no magic wands or dragons or wizards, which is a lot of the stuff that I like to read. It's just two people having a conversation, or a lady going shopping, or a woman waiting for her husband to come home from the store with her kid. And these are all so it's mundane and ordinary. And if that's all we focus on, then we're going to be bored by a text that we're reading. And I think that might be something that maybe many students would say, this is not interesting. Nothing is happening here. Well, what we're trying to do in looking at these texts is to say that actually there's a lot going on underneath the surface. There's a lot of subtext that's happening. There's a lot of things that are unspoken. And how do we know these things? Because we understand that ordinary life is far from ordinary. Have you ever had something wild happen to you and you're like, you can't make this up? Real life is almost more fantastical than any fantasy story, because wild things happen and people do, they say strange things. And I think that that's kind of the beauty of realism, is looking at a text and saying, okay, yeah, this is two people carrying on a conversation over the course of, their whole life. But look at all the stuff that's going on, like what is said and what is unsaid. As Lathrop says, what is seen and unseen of human nature. And I think what's kind of scary but worthwhile in reading literature, particularly your realist texts that we're going to be looking at, is you find yourself identifying characteristics of human nature that maybe we wish we didn't have. And then what's fun about that is I think the goal is to analyze yourself. Am I like this character? Am I not like this character? Do I need to improve myself in some way? These realist texts give us an opportunity for a lot of self-awareness, which I think is extremely important in life. So I'm super excited. This is probably, some of these readings are some of my absolute favorite readings. But this quote really kind of sets the tone for the paper, for where I want your mind to be when you're kind of approaching your thesis statement and your claims throughout your paper. So let me get down into kind of like my introduction here. Our authors in the first unit take a realistic approach to writing. The texts reflect a look at reality, and they ask questions like, what is real? What is at the heart of this perspective? What about human nature makes this dialogue or plot possible? We could make the argument that each of the texts we read in Unit 1 attempts to look at either a major or minor aspect of real life in order to make a claim about what is real as it pertains to human nature. So, our texts are looking at everyday life. And next week, we're going to talk about the characteristics of realism because, in the introduction to Unit 1 that we looked at last week, or that you might still be working throughout this unit, our authors, or the editor of our textbook mentions that, we have realism and then we have naturalism, naturalism, which is a little bit more of like the nitty gritty, or really not the nitty gritty, but the gritty gritty of real life, the gross stuff, the stuff that you don't want to look at. Because a lot of realism, and we'll talk about this next week, is looking at like middle class people whose lives aren't necessarily all that difficult, particularly socially or socioeconomically, I guess. So, we're looking at realism, but a particular facet of realism is sort of like some of the most boring things that happen to people. And when you're looking at that, the goal here is to kind of figure out like, what's the beauty behind the mundane? What's the argument the author is making by giving us such a boring text? And I'm using boring in a very, I think, stretchy kind of way. The texts aren't boring if you're really, really reading them. But if you're looking for, like explosions and action and car chases, you're not probably going to find them in the plot. Okay, so I've got a prompt here, and you can take this prompt in one of two ways, or I guess one of three ways. You can focus your paper just on what you see in kind of that first bracket. You can focus your paper on just what you see in this second bracket, or you can kind of combine them both together if you want. If you have a thesis statement that adheres to kind of the idea of this paper but isn't exactly what I'm asking for here, run it by me via email. Let's see if it's going to work. If you've kind of wanted to go in a certain direction that's not exactly prompt 1 or 2, I'm pretty flexible here. So select one of the texts we've read or we will read in Unit 1. If you're looking at this video in like week 2, then know that you have all of Unit 1 to pick a text. So go ahead and take a look at the course schedule if you haven't already. Read through the titles of each of, the readings up until week 6. And if there's something in there that we haven't read yet that you're like, oh, I'd probably be really interested in this, you're more than welcome to pick it. If there's something in the textbook from 1865 to 1914 in that Unit 1 section that we aren't reading, but that maybe you know about or you're really interested in, you are more than welcome to send me an email and say, could I pick this text? That it has to be in our book, and it has to be between the time frame that we're studying, and it has to be a realist text. Okay, so you have some options here. One, you can analyze the text in order to make an argument about reality or human nature that the text is making. There might be many. You might be able to say, well, maybe the author is saying that everyone does this thing, everyone feels this way, everyone has this type of emotion. Everyone will fall or fail when this happens to them, something like that. Maybe there are a number of things you could focus on, but in your paper, I want you to just pick one. That's going to give you the opportunity to have a much deeper analysis, and that's what I'm looking for in your literature papers. Deep analysis. I don't want surface level. You can summarize the text in the introduction, but really in your body paragraphs, I want you to dig deep down into that text, look at the language, quote the language, take it apart. So by just picking one text and one argument about reality or human nature, you're going to be able to really dig further into that text as opposed to too much like surface level content. The other thing that you could do is analyze the text for its elements of realism to explain what the author's intended purpose and message is. So, next week, again, we're going to kind of cover some of these key characteristics of realism, and maybe you want to say something like the goal of so-and-so's text is to tell the reader this message. I think that there is an overlap in prompts 1 and 2. I think that these two things kind of connect really well together. So if you find that your paper is doing both of these things, prompts 1 and 2, then you certainly can, kind of merge them together into a thesis statement that works for both. If you really are just focusing on one, just make sure that your thesis clearly identifies, your main claim and where, kind of what prompt you're falling under. In your paper, be sure to provide clear, direct, and specific analysis of the text in order to support your claims. Be sure to introduce, quote, analyze, and interpret specific evidence from the text. I definitely want to see your text in your paper, which means I want you to quote it, and then I want you to analyze the quote, and I want you to connect it to your thesis statement. One of the things that we're going to try and really work on throughout Unit 1 as we build our first paper is heavy analysis. That's going to come out in practice through like our discussion boards and our responses and things like that. So as you are, getting your feedback on that, make sure you apply the feedback I'm giving you on the smaller assignments to the analysis and the critical thinking that you're doing in your papers as well. Don't include any secondary research in this paper. So this is just kind of my warning to you. Don't look at outside sources. Don't even just try to get information. Don't go to Schmoop and look up analysis of this text. It's what I want you to know about reading literature, and this is the thing that I love about it. There's never ever a wrong answer. So if you tell me that The Storm by Kate Chopin is a text about, I don't know, purity or something, maybe I don't see that. Maybe I've never seen that. Maybe no critical scholar of Kate Chopin's work has ever identified the text as being about purity, but you can, and you have an argument and you have a way to back it up, and you do that in your paper. That's all I need. Literature and the study of literature isn't necessarily about what's right and wrong. Sure, there are some critical theorists who would disagree with me, but they aren't grading your papers. So you can say anything you want about a text you can respond to this prompt in any way you want. Even if you're like, this is coming out of left field, this is a bit of a stretch, as long as you can use the text to back up your claim and show me where you find this working in the text, you can say anything you want about, realism as it applies to this. What is nice about that, and how does this connect to secondary research, is that because you can say anything and all you need is the text, I don't want you to go looking for kind of the obvious answers that are out there on the internet. Please don't do that. You will hurt your ability to think critically about a text if you always go looking for what other people have said. I think that some students, they get worried. They're like, well, what if you think I looked and I didn't look? Trust me, I have done this for long enough that I know the difference between a student really coming up with their own ideas, even if their ideas are the same as everyone else's, versus looking at other people's. Because once you read the words on the page that someone else has written, it's really difficult to get their words out of your head, and then their words end up cropping up in your paper. I want to show you a quick example thesis statement. I kind of focused this one on the reading for this week. In A Beast in the Jungle, Henry James prioritizes character and subtext and dialogue over plot to warn readers about the consequences of egoism. So really I'm kind of just focusing on prompt 2 here, which again says, analyze the text for its elements of realism. So I'm talking about character and subtext and dialogue. In order to say the purpose and the message, he's warning, right? This is a warning text. And the message is, there are consequences of egoism. I could probably elaborate on this in my thesis. I could identify what those consequences are. I didn't do that. That could make my thesis stronger. But as a whole, this is a solid, B+, A- thesis statement. And by the way, I'm not sure this is the argument I would make, but it came to my mind as I was rereading Henry James for this week. So, the structure of your literature paper is like a structure of any other paper you've written. You've got an introduction, you've got body paragraphs and a conclusion. The content here just kind of outlines like what should an introduction look like. Start with a hook sentence, identify your title and your text of the work that you're reading, or the author and the title, sorry. Summarize it really quickly, and the introduction with a thesis statement. This outline kind of suggests that the introduction would maybe be about 4 sentences. It should be a little bit longer than that. You want to work to, transition between ideas and develop your introduction, but it doesn't need to be necessarily like creative or lengthy or anything like that. What matters the most in this class for me is body paragraphs. So make sure you've got a strong topic sentence that identifies the main idea. Give some context for your evidence. Make sure you're quoting the text. Make sure you're analyzing that evidence. So don't just drop quotes in. Quote the text. And then look at the quote directly. Point to things in the quote. One of the things that I think is really fun to do is to quote something and then go and look at a dictionary for the meaning of the words in the quote and see what you can pull out of that. Like, for example, whenever I was reading A Beast in the Jungle for this week, in section 5 or 6, the word pilgrimage comes up. And of course I know what that word means just in my mind, but I wanted to look at the dictionary definition of pilgrimage, and that made a huge difference in the way that I interpreted and analyzed John Marcher's sort of whole relationship with May. And once I just looked at that definition, it inspired me to think of May in a completely different way. And so really looking at the words that the author has chosen to use, especially if they're interesting words, Henry James could have said journey or walk, but he used the word pilgrimage, and that was definitely done for a reason. and it kind of changes things. One of the things that is really important to me as you are writing body paragraphs is never ever beginning or ending your paragraph on a direct quote. Direct quotes function as evidence, and you want to be in charge of the paragraph, not your evidence. So the first thing your reader remembers and the last thing your reader remembers should be your words on the page, not a quote from the text. So just keep this in mind as you're writing. And then, of course, your conclusion, restate your thesis. Why does this matter? You need to have a works cited page. Again, no any additional secondary research is required. I just want you to analyze the text on your own. I'm looking for a full 4 pages. It's fine if you go it's fine if you go over. Ideally, no more than 6 pages. If you get real inspired, you can surpass that, but I would say that, anything more than 6 pages starts to bring up red flags for me. Let's see, what else was I going to say? The works cited page is not one of the pages in your paper, so your paper should be 4 pages of your writing, and then you should have an additional 5th page of your works cited page. Basic MLA format, in-text citations, and works cited page stuff is in the LMS. You can find that in, let me see, what is it? I think it is called MLA format resources. Pretty straightforward. So you can find information here. If there's anything you can't find that you're looking for, just let me know. I can send it to you and then also post it in the LMS. And then just turn it in the LMS. Here is the rubric. I'm looking at formatting. I'm looking at your thesis statement. I'm looking at kind of your ability to identify your claim. Is it unified throughout your paper? Provide evidence and analyze and interpret that evidence. And then, of course, I'm also looking at how you develop and structure your paper. I don't have a section in here for grammar. It's just kind of assumed that at this stage in a 200 level literature college course that your grammar meets expectations for college and academic level writing. So if you're feeling like maybe you need some work on that, let me know. I can send you some grammar resources, or if you have specific questions that I can answer, let me know about that as well. Okay, I think that pretty much covers my walkthrough on the paper. If you have questions, please don't hesitate. You can email me anytime. I'm here to help you guys with anything that you need help with. So just reach out if you need it. Otherwise, I hope y'all have a great week.